Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to demonstrate a number of techniques that I use to create the animation that you can see in front of you. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about modeling. I used the sapling generator for the majority of the trees and I constructed the central bare tree just by hand. But I want to quickly cover how to do the snow falling effect, how to give the whiteness that's on the top of branches throughout the scene to give the effect of snow having settled there, and quickly how to distribute some trees around the scene in a pleasing way and in a controllable way. So I'll be going quite quickly and you can always go back and relook if you need to. You can see there was a few texture problems toward the end there in the higher res image that I created. I didn't notice those until after I'd rendered it, so you can only really see that in that final image. I also used denoising, which has removed some of the surface detail that I put into the snow, but overall I think it's quite pleasing. I feel the snow effect itself is quite realistic. The speed of the snow, the way it's falling, and even the shape of the little balls of snow looks like the sort of snow that I see anyway. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. Feel free to comment or ask questions or even dislike the video. And if you don't like the video, I'd be very interested to see what the issues you spotted were so that I can improve going forward. If you're a Patreon supporter, I do upload these files for any use available to my Patreon supporters, and I upload tutorials quite regularly. So let's start the tutorial. So just quickly, how would we create the trees? I've already imported the trees that I created before, but I'll quickly just show you that what I used is the sapling generator. Make sure under preferences, under add-ons, if you start typing sapling, you can make sure the add curve sapling tree gen is on, and the add curve bit tells you where you're going to find it. So if you just press Shift A, you can then go to curves and you will see the sapling tree gen. You get a little set of options down here. You can load some presets. So I've got one called Douglas fir. There is already a Douglas fir in here, but I made some slight modifications. Do bear in mind when you add further detail that you are going to add quite a lot of them. But nevertheless, you can get away with quite a bit. You can play around with branch splitting, you can add more branch splits, for example, and so on and so forth. And I will go into the materials on them. And I created two sets of trees. You can see I've got these pine trees. The needles are essentially leaves, but they were set to a very narrow shape, so they created these needles. And then I've got the Douglas firs over here. Once you've created a version of your tree, what you can do is go back to geometry and you can save a preset. You can export a preset. So you just type a name in there, click export a preset. And then what you can do, you can then just move that one out the way, then add another one under curves, sapling tree gen, and load your preset again, but this time just change the random seed to some other number. It'll still have all the same parameters, so it'll essentially be the same tree, but some of the parameters will have different random seeds on them, so we'll give a different tree essentially of the same species. And you can do that a number of times so that you can get a collection of trees. So I'm just going to delete those, and over on the right here, I did the same with some fir trees. Those have got leaves added. That's an option in the tree gen as well. I've got a number of other tutorials where I talk about the tree generator. This has got materials on, but I'm going to quickly go through how the materials work on them. And I wanted to control my two different species of trees separately. So I selected all of my pine trees there, and I'm going to press M and just say new collection, and we'll call those pine trees. And then over here is my Douglas firs. And we'll press M again, new collection, fir trees. So back over here, and I'm going to add a mesh, which is a plane. I'm going to scale that up quite a bit. And in edit mode, I'm going to subdivide it a couple of times and then turn up fractal, which starts to add some waviness to it, as it were. And then I'm going to subdivide again. We've still got the fractal on, perhaps lower it a bit and perhaps add another subdivision just to give us some lumps and bumps. If I come out of edit mode, I'm going to add a subdivision surface by pressing Ctrl 2, set it to shade smooth, and I'm actually going to apply that as well. So that's smoothed the landscape out and added more geometry, as you can see. So I've also got this other tree that I made here. This is now a mesh. All I did was take a path and extrude it out in front of an image of a dead tree to give me an idea of what it should look like. And then I converted that to a mesh. So I'm just going to put that in the scene as my sort of marker and just embed it into the landscape. And one thing I did, I'm going to pull it forward slightly, perhaps over there. And if you look below, you can see when it's poking through the landscape, and put it right there. And because I wanted to sort of have an effect of snow piling up on one side, selected the landscape and then select the geometry around the tree and then Control plus just to increase that, and then just subdivide. Doesn't really matter if I've still got fractal on, perhaps a couple of times, and then Control minus a couple of times, and then subdivide again and subdivide again, and then just come quite a way in. I'm just going to select, I think, a couple of vertices in the middle, press O to turn on proportional editing, G, Z, and just bring the landscape up a little bit. And what I also then did is just move the tree slightly to one side, so it's like the snow is piled up just there. And if need be, you can also smooth it off a little. So right click and just say smooth vertices, just in case it's a little bit too angular. Now I'm going to select all the vertices and press U and say unwrap. So now we're ready to define where our trees are going to be. We're going to use a simple geometry node setup for that. Press C to get a selection box while I'm in edit mode on the landscape, and I'm just going to select this area. Now, strictly speaking, especially if it's a still image, you can actually remove these areas once you know where the camera is going to be looking if they're outside of the camera view. But I wanted an animation that would allow me to move around a little bit, so I actually kept all of my trees, but that will affect obviously the time it takes to render. But that said, even though it was a cycles render, it wasn't that bad. So I'm now just going to come over to here. Under Object Data Properties, I've clicked the plus, and that gives me Group. I'm going to click that and change the name of that to Trees, and just click Assign. So if I unselect everything and then select, you can see we've got a tree area defined. If you want to, you can go to Weight Paint, and you see very fast fall off at the moment, and you can reduce the fall off. What that will do is it'll mean rather than the trees start in a very sudden area, there will be a gradual increase in the density of the trees as we go further into the forest. One last thing, I suggest selecting some vertices just in from the end there with proportional editing still on, G, Z, and just lift them up a little bit. That means you don't ever quite see the very edge, which can look a little odd sometimes. Obviously you would if you were looking over here, but in this direction you can't. And if I turn my camera on, make it a bit bigger, and my plan is to look from somewhere over here, and I'm going to adjust the focal length as well, and there we go. So that plane is our land. We'll just move our trees out of the way a little bit there. One thing to be careful of is once you've got some groups that are going to be used for particles or geometry node type particles, make sure that group isn't still selected, otherwise when you add a new object to the scene it will appear in there. While I'm creating objects, we'll also create the snow, and to do that I actually used the rock generator. So again, just make sure that's enabled. I said something like 6 rocks. It doesn't matter too much. You don't want them too high a resolution. I had them fairly rough and the detail quite low. And then we can just separate them. And some of them I flattened out quite a bit. So make sure they're all on shade smooth. And then I'm going to select them all and move those to a new collection called Snow. We'll add a material and we'll just say New Snowflakes. And we'll click here and we'll say copy material to selected. So they've all got that material now. So that's 3 sets of assets that we've created there. And we're ready to put our initial forest into the scene. I'll just add a material to the landscape, which is land snow. Obviously just a white material at the moment. And then we'll open a new window up. We'll go to the geometry node editor and we'll say new. So it's a relatively straightforward geometry node system, but I did 2 and stitched them together in order to be able to have the 2 different trees. I could have created 2 separate geometry node systems for the 2 separate trees, and that would have been fine too. But I thought I'd just put them into one to allow me more ease of control. So if we start off, here is our initial geometry. In this case, I want to keep the geometry. If I break that link, you can see the geometry vanishes, which it would be broken as soon as I started to add any nodes, unless I add the join geometry node, and I'll drop that there. And now I can add an instance on points node. Under instances, we can instance on points, take the geometry into that, which gives it its points, and then take the output of that to the geometry. Now initially nothing happens because we need another node, and this one is the under points, the distribute points on faces node. So I'll drop that one in there. And now I need to say what I'm going to instance. So I suggest you turn the density right down. We'll just put a density of 1 here, and we'll set the scale to 0.1 initially. Then we can drag our fir tree group in and drop that into the instance and click separate children and reset children. And you can see they're rather large at the moment, so we'll go for much smaller than that. Go for 0.01. And at the moment it's instancing all of them, so we need to click pick instance, and then we'll just get a single tree rather than all of them in one place. And you can see we've got trees appearing all over the place now, so we can now turn the density up a little bit, bearing in mind we're going to be adding another set of trees as well. But you can see they're appearing everywhere at the moment. So what we now need to do is take the selection option out to here. And if we press N and bring up the right hand menu, make sure the group input node is selected. And if we click where it says selection, we can just say trees area. And now if we go to the modifiers, we get this trees area option, and there's a little flag there. We click that flag, we can click in here and we can just select the trees vertex group. And now you can see they're only appearing where we want them. We can adjust the seed, of course. So I can take that out to the node group and change the name of that for fir tree seed. And then we can try different distributions of them here. And now what we want to do is have some randomization in the size of the trees. So we're going to add, under utilities, a random value node. We'll leave it at float because I want X, Y and Z to all vary together. And I used a quite small value of 0.035. And we'll see how that looks for this particular scene. But then I wanted to be able to control the overall size. So I also added, under utilities, a math node. Set that to multiply. Take the random value into one side of that. Doesn't really matter which side. And then took the other side again into my node group. So selecting that one, this is fir tree size. And we'll go for 0.01 initially. And we'll see what that looks like. It may be too small. And we take that into scale. You can see that's too small now, so I can adjust the fir tree size here. And I don't really want minimum of 0. So we'll put something like 0.01 as the minimum there. So that's the size. And then I decided I wanted a slight variation in the angle of the trees. Didn't want them all completely perfectly vertical, even though that's the general trend for those trees. So created another random value node and added under vector a combine X, Y, Z, because I want to affect the X, Y and Z separately. So if we feed that one into Y, for example, and I'll go from 0 to the existing value 0.035 and then take that into rotation, getting a bit of a spider map in here, but there we go. You can see that affects the tilt on those trees. So we'll go back to 0.035. I'll just put a random seed on there. So they've just got a very slight tilt on the Y. And now I'm going to duplicate that and put that into the X and just put a different seed on so they don't always have the same tilt. And then duplicate it again, maximize it there and put that into Z. But this is now the rotation of the trees. So that can be quite a lot. So I'm going to put that, I think it's in radians. So I'll just put it up to a big number and give it a different seed. And now each tree is its own size and got its own slight variation on rotation. So now what I want to do is box select all of these nodes and then go to node, make group. So if I press tab, you can see we've now created this group called node group at the moment. We'll call that fir trees under label as well. And then we'll create a copy. Now immediately something to be aware of is this little 2 here. So essentially not only are these two groups copies of each other, they are connected. So before we do anything, I'm just going to click this 2 here, which now makes them unique. You can see that's node group 001 and that's node group. We now need to take the mesh into it. We need to bring selection into it. And then we want a new input there, which we will call pine tree seed, and another new input, which we will call pine tree size. I guess we can put the two sizes and the two seeds together. And then the output of that will need to connect to the geometry. So they're separate node groups now. So if I select this node group and go into it, currently it's still showing fir trees. I'm going to change that to pine trees there now. And you can now see we've got a selection of different ones. You can just play around with the seed to get what you want. Just press tab to come out of it. And you might also want to bring out density. So if I bring that density out there, this is fir tree density, and we can do the same for the other one. Obviously it's better if you develop it all first and then you haven't got to make any changes. So that goes into there as fir tree density, and this is pine tree density. So we can just take that one out as well. So they're both the same at the moment, but that's it for the node groups. Nothing more to play with there. So the pine trees I think are a bit big, so we can just adjust these here and bring them down. We can perhaps increase the size of our fir trees a little, and fir tree density can now go up. Maybe we'll go for 100, maybe 75, and we'll put the pine tree density up as well, perhaps 50. And then we can play with the seed till we get some distribution that we quite like. And go back to my camera and pull it back a little. And one of the reasons for the fir trees is it helps to cover that horizon a little bit. So that will do for the tree distribution. And next we're going to talk about the materials and then how to do the snow falling. So I'm just going to resize that top window and then change to the shader editor, and we'll select one of our fir trees. So you can see, because I imported these have already got the materials on them. So I'll just quickly talk through what this is about. So we've got a color being input from this color ramp. Without that, you can see what they look like there. If I home in on the particular one I've got selected, which is this one, and we go to the colored preview mode, turn the overlays off again, you can see a preview, a sort of EV preview of what the material would look like. This isn't the full cycles version at the moment. I just wanted it to be quite quick. And that's just a brown color. Now in this color ramp, I've got several different colors. So color 0 is quite a dark brown. Color 1 is the same color, but then at color 2, we've got this basically white. And then inputting into that is a separate X, Y, and Z node. And going into that is a geometry node outputting the normals. So in other words, the normals indicate the direction that a surface is facing. And I've split out of that the Z. And then I'm using that to control what color I then output into my main wood color for this tree. And once it's updated, you can see what that now gives us with the particular setup I've got here. White along the top. So in other words, something that's going in the Z direction is either going positive or negative. And when it's going positive, it's giving us white. When it goes negative, it gives us the color we've got here, which is very dark, but it's not quite black. And you can change, if you like, the amount of snow or how far round the snow piles up on there by just adjusting the color ramp. So particularly this one, you can see it goes down, and you can make it a sharper fall off. I've got it at cardinal at the moment. If you set it to ease, it'll be a more gentle fall off, and you get a sort of more blurry look. That may or may not be what you want. And you can also see, because I'm also adding a roughness and a bump noise texture. So I've just got a noise texture here, going into a bump node, strength is 0.2, and then going into the normals. And I'm also doing something similar with a noise texture going into displacement. So that's giving, as it were, virtual normals that aren't completely smooth. And you can see that gives us a nice impression, because it takes account of that, because this is a shader, as if there are little lumps and bumps on the surface, some of which are catching snow and some of which aren't. And that's essentially how I managed to set it up so that we get snow on the top surface. And you can do that with anything. And obviously all the trees have got that. The pine trees, slightly different, same sort of idea. But if I focus in on one of those, you can see the wood element works the same way. So if I go to materials and we go to the wood, it's pretty much the same thing. I don't have a texture on this one. I probably should, just to make it look a little nicer, but you don't see the bark as much on this one. But essentially the same thing. I've only got one node here for the color of the bark, but you can see it works exactly the same way. And I could obviously add some texture in there. Now I've done the same with the pine needles, but because they were derived from leaves, they're very flat and singular. So the effect isn't so easy to do. They haven't got a 3D shape as such. They're flat objects. You do get some variation. So you can see, depending on how you've got it set up here, I've got it so that some of the needles are showing white as if they've accrued some snow, and some of them are showing as green. It's not, as I say, as straightforward with the pine needles, but if you get a mix of it, I think that gives you a reasonably good impression. And you can play around with what you use, of course. So you could use X, Y, or Z. It's up to you. But when you change that, you will need to reset where your color ramp is, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the normals. I started off with random per island, but that didn't give me such a good look. You can even try pointiness, but they'll all be the same pointiness, of course, so that might not work so well. So I think normal probably works well enough. So we need to add a sun into our scene because you can see, although the scene is very dim, you can see it's a very snowy scene, so that's fine. But we need to put a sun in there just to improve it, or at least a sky. So if we go to the world settings and then press N over here, if you've got it enabled, you'll have the dynamic sky option under create. So make sure under preferences, under add-ons, that dynamic sky under lighting is enabled. This isn't an essential thing, but I think it's quite good. Open that up and click create, and it tells you to select dynamic 1 from the properties world. So we're in the world material settings. Click in here, we've now got one called dynamic 1. And then when I select that and we go to the cycles view, you can see it's much brighter now. And you can see we've actually got clouds in the sky and things like that. And there's various options to play with here. So you can play with the cloud opacity and so on. And you can turn the sun brightness up. I ended up putting an actual sun in there as well because it's still very diffuse. But you can see that gives you an immediate bright scene with the starter for the sun. So I'm just going to come out just to wireframe, put the overlays back on, and I'll put my 3D cursor somewhere like that, and we'll add under lights a sunlight. Doesn't really matter where sunlights are, they're parallel rays that just come in from infinity, or how big the object is. But it obviously helps when you're trying to visualize what effect it's going to have on the scene before you actually look at it in a rendered view. So I want to be able to see the shadows, so having it somewhat across like that is roughly what I want. And we'll try it at that angle. We'll give it a very, very slight yellow color, and we'll give it a strength of 3 for the moment. So it's a very bright sun, and then we'll see what that looks like. But before I do, what I'm going to do, I think, is turn the trees off just to speed things up a little bit, because there's a lot of trees, that's a lot of geometry. So if I select the land, just go to the modifiers and just turn that off there, and they've disappeared. And I can now go to rendered view, and it shouldn't take too long. We've just got our lone tree there in the middle. So that's actually a very bright sun, as you can see. And the reason for that is because there's probably a lot of them. Let's remove that out of there and put it up there where it should be. It's always worth making sure you've got the right collection selected when you add an object. And then we can play around with the size, which is the angle. So the angle's quite large at the moment. So we have got shadows. I'm going to turn the strength down to 2 now, just darken it a little bit. We might want to turn the strength of the dynamic world sky down a little bit. So we'll go to 0.5 on that. And that allows us to see those shadows a little better. And then we can play around with trying different angles. So if we go to a smaller angle, we'll get sharper shadows. If we go to a bigger angle, say 180 degrees, we get softer shadows in theory. If you go to 0, obviously you get the sharpest shadow you can get. And the idea is that's a pinpoint sun, but we probably don't want that. So I'm going to go for about 0.25. I think I'll turn the dynamic sky brightness down again. So we'll go for 0.25 now on that. And you can see there's our shadow for our main tree. So it's a sort of overcast, slightly dim day, but we've got a bright sun shining there. It's perhaps not entirely accurate. I'm going to lighten that sky up a little bit in terms of color. So there's less contrast between the clouds and the sky, which gives you the more idea that the day is slightly overcast, and brighten it up slightly. So if we select the land and we bring our trees back, just to have a quick look. Obviously that's not denoised at the moment, but that's looking pretty fair. That's giving a reasonably good impression of trees in a snowy landscape. Because of the brightness, you do lose a lot of the detail on the land. And at the moment, I've just got white on the landscape anyway. So I'll turn those trees off again. And although we won't see a lot of it, I will quickly just put some texture on the landscape, some snow texture. So it will depend on how close you're looking at it. Obviously, things do tend to be blown out, even in your eyes, when they're very, very bright. So as a quick starter, I'm just going to add a texture, which is an image texture. And then I had a tileable snow texture here. I ended up making a slightly more complicated setup because of the size of the scene, but I think it was probably unnecessary. So we'll just go with this. And initially you can just take that straight in. Obviously it might need to be rescaled, and you can either do that by adjusting the UV map, assuming you've unwrapped it. So I'll just make sure it is unwrapped and just press U and unwrap. Pretty sure I did that earlier. Or we can just add an input, which is a texture coordinate input. Drop that in there. There are some quick ways to do these, but I just like to show people what it is we're doing. Probably want to use UV rather than generated. And then add under vector a mapping node. It's easy to understand what you're doing if you set it to texture, but it doesn't really matter. And then we can change the scale. So if we go to 0.3, that's a finer scale, and you can see that there. What I also then wanted to do was add a little bit of lump and bump to it. So there was effectively shadows rather than images of shadows, actual shadows being created. So if I add under converter a color ramp, I've just put that into the color at the moment so I can see what I'm doing, and I'm just narrowing that in, and maybe you want to use ease. You can see the texture more there. Maybe want to even go smaller than I have, so maybe 0.1. That's possibly a bit too small. You can see the pattern too easily there. We'll go for 0.2. It's obvious when it's like this. It's not so obvious once we use it properly. So take that out of there. It's gone back to white. And then we'll add under vector bump node. We take the color from that color ramp into the height, and we take the bump output, the normal output, into the normal on the material. And that's now simulating the idea of a surface texture bumps, but they're very extreme at the moment. So we want to turn the strength down, and I used something like this, 0.3, 0.4, something like that. And obviously we can take the original color back into here as well. And if you want to add a little bit more detail, perhaps just to help wash out some of the tiling effects, we can just add under texture, noise texture, and then add under converter math node. Set the math node to multiply, and I suggest a very small value, let's say 0.03, something like that. Connect that into displacement on the shader output. Take the noise texture into the other side of the math node, and then I set a value as something like 2500. Put detail up at max, and that just adds a little bit of fine detail to the surface. In fact, if I take the bump off and the color off, you'll be able to see a little bit more. So there you can see there is just a little bit of surface detail added. It might be a bit small at the moment. If I went up to all the way to 0.1, you can start to see it a little bigger there now. You might even want to go a higher scale than that, so 5000 there. So it just adds that surface ripple, and as I say, we overlay that with the color and also our bump here. So the combination of them just gives you that more natural sort of look. And then finally, we need to add our snow. So I'm going to add a simple plane and scale that up. It looked distorted because of the camera there. Just have it to be about the size of the landscape. You don't want to go mad on this because you are going to create quite a few particles from it. And then lift it up somewhat. How far you lift it is up to you, but if it's too far, it's going to take longer before the snow has fallen into the scene. I'm assuming that this is animated scene, which is why I'm doing it with just a plane, so that the snow is just falling from that one direction. If you just wanted a still scene, then you might be better off using a cube and then using the volume of the cube for the source of the particles. And we're going to do this with particles, as I said. I can see here that this is actually being clipped by the camera. So if we go to our camera properties, we need to just turn that clipping plane up a little bit. There you go. You can see we've got the end of that visible now. So selecting that plane, we'll just call this snow generator, and then come to particles and just click plus. We'll get a particle system. If I click play, you can see we've got particles coming down, which is pretty much what we want, but you see they're not quite reaching the ground at the moment. So we need to increase the lifetime of the particles. I'm going to set the frame start and frame end to match my current animation. I did something like 1000 frames. You'll probably need to do more than 250, but I'll just set it to that for the moment. And then the lifetime, let's try 200 and see if the particles reach the ground at that point. We don't necessarily need them going much beyond the ground. That's about right at the moment, but we may need to tweak that in a moment if we decide the particles are falling too quickly. So they're difficult to see at the moment, so we're going to make some adjustments there. I used about 5000 particles, so we'll try that. And bear in mind that's total number of particles emitted over the duration of the animation, not in one go. So that's looking okay at the moment. We'll come back to the cache shortly, but we'll leave it there for the moment. And then we'll come to velocity. So I set the normal velocity is the speed that these particles are being emitted from normal. And it's not unusual for them to actually be emitted vertically initially. So that's just down to the initial orientation of the snow generator object. So just for simplicity, I'm actually going to turn that over. So rotate X 180, and now instead of going up and then falling down, they're just being emitted down. But I felt they were a little fast anyway, so I set that to 0.1 meters per second. It just means they take a little bit more time to speed up because they're working as though they're under gravity at the moment, so they do speed up over time. Then under rotation, and this will be more significant shortly, I put randomize up to 1. I left it on velocity hair for rotation. I put phase up to maximum and randomize phase up to maximum, and most importantly I click dynamic, which means that they will be rotating over time. And then angular velocity, which is the most important thing, that was set to random, so they're not all rotating in the same way, and I set that to about 0.9. Physics I left at default. You could multiply mass with size, that's up to you. I left it as it was. Under forces, I did add a little Brownian. So Brownian adds a sort of wobble to them, as if the very light objects are being moved around by air currents and things like that. So I put that at 3. I also added a little bit of drag. I'll put 0.06 on there. That helps to slow some of their acceleration a little bit. Then we'll come down to field weights. And this is the main one I changed, which is gravity. So let's try what I use, which might be too little, but we'll go for 0.05. So you can see they're now falling much more slowly, which is probably too slowly. Bearing in mind this is pretty much rendering at full speed at the moment. So let's go for 0.2 for this one. It all depends on the scale of your scene and things like that. As I say, they do accelerate as they fall, as things would. And you can see we've got them coming down more quickly there. And then finally, what we need to do is tell it what it is we want to render. So under the render options, we don't want to show the emitter. So I've unclicked that and it won't show in the scene when we render now. We don't want halos, we want a collection. And the collection we want is the one we made earlier, which is the snow collection. I'll add some scale randomness, and we need to say pick random from the collection as well. And then we can tweak the scale to get objects that are of an appropriate size for our scene. Those are probably quite big. We'll maybe go for 0.3, something like that. So if I just let it get through to there, and we'll stop it there, and we'll have a look what that looks like rendered. So you can see we've got these little balls of snow, which sometimes that is what snow looks like. Sometimes it's little flat things. It's entirely up to you what you use in that respect. So for the snow, all I did was actually put the landscape texture on them, the landscape material on them. They're called rocks because we used the rock generator. Got the first one selected there, and I'm going to change them to the land snow material to start with. And then I'm going to click this little 2, and we'll change that name back to snow part, something like that. You can see those are my rocks or snow parts there. And select all of these, and then finally select the one that I've just created that snow parts material on, and just say copy material to selected. So it's essentially got the same material as the landscape at the moment. And the only thing I really changed was that I added a little bit of transmission, something like 0.2, and transmission roughness at 0.5. Just to allow for the fact that sunlight will come through them when you're looking up at them, because they are small particles. The final thing I did was, because snow particles do actually fall quite quickly, I did add a little bit of motion blur. So if we go, first of all, just go to light path, make sure everything's okay there, and turn off reflective and refractive caustics, just because they're not needed for a scene like this. We're going to add a little bit of volumetric. So I will just put that at 1 click. Don't want to go too mad on that because it will increase the render time once you start to use volumetric. And then enable motion blur. So I put it up slightly, about 0.6, 0.65, something like that. And when you render, it will just render several frames, and your little snow particles will be blurred because they're moving. One of the things you do want to do once you're happy with your snow, whether you're doing an animation or a still frame, we'll just select our snow generator again, make sure you're on particles, and then come to the cache and just say bake all dynamics. It should bake pretty quickly, and then save your file. And that will mean you can very quickly scrub through, and you won't get any strange effects, especially if you start rendering halfway through a scene, which sometimes means it could get a little bit upset about where the particles should be. So let's go to the beginning where the particles haven't really started to be created yet. And we're now going to add another object into the scene, which is a cube. And we'll increase the size of that. It's hard to see because everything's white, but it needs to be about the size of the landscape, maybe slightly bigger. It doesn't need to be that high though, so I'm scaling it on the Z a little bit there and just lifting it up. It does need to reach all of the land really. Doesn't matter too much, but we'll have it about there. So if we look from the camera, we're inside that box. We'll change the name of that box to mist, bog, whatever you want to call it. And we'll go to materials and say new. And we don't need the principled shader for this one. We'll delete that. And I'll add under shaders a principled volume shader, and we'll just drag that into volume, not surface. You can see it's essentially vanished. I'm going to go to rendered view at this point, which will slow things down a little bit. Now at the moment that density is up at 1, so we're not really going to see anything. If I put that density down to a low number, we'll try 0.1, lighten up a bit, but we'll go for 0.01 now, and you can just about make out our tree there, and you can see it's quite a dim, foggy sort of scene. I'm going to brighten that mist or fog up, and we'll play around with some other things in a moment. So now I'm going to add a texture which is a noise texture, and also under converters, the usual color ramp. I'm going to take the noise factor into the color ramp, set the color ramp to ease, and then I pull the bottom side quite up to somewhere like that and the top side down to there, and I've got some further changes to make, but we'll try somewhere around there. And then the color goes out not to color but to density. So you can already see we've got patches now of our mist. I set this to 4D because I wanted to be able to change the mist over time, so that allows you to play around with this W value. I set the scale to about 7, so not much higher than it defaults to, and I put the detail at about 4. I also added some distortion because that sort of adds curliness to the distortion, which you might expect from smoke and things like that. So I'd set the distortion to about 1.5, and then we need to work out what we're going to do in here. So this was important because I wanted to do an animation. If you're going to do a still, you can just probably use the 3D version or just not worry about it any further. But I also wanted to be able to set it so that if I changed the length of the animation, I didn't need to go and keyframe this again. So I didn't actually use keyframes for this. What I did was I clicked in here and typed hash frame divided by 4500 because I wanted it only to change very slowly, and then press return. You see it turns purple, and even at frame 1 I've now got a tiny number, and if I scroll through the animation you can see that number's changing. And what that's doing is it's very slowly moving the noise through time. So effectively the noise pattern, if I go say from one end of the animation to the other, if you make a note we've got quite a dark spot there, and then I go back to the beginning of the animation, you can see it's a different shape. It's still dark there, but there's other areas around it, and maybe look at that one over there, and you can see that dark spot has now vanished. For the animation I was creating, dividing by about 4500, so that's effectively what that does, is it takes the frame number that you're on, divides it by 4500, and then uses that as the W value. And so if you then change to 5000 frames, it would still be animating at the same speed. So you can play around with the length of your animation easily. Obviously you'll need to play around with how many particles you've got and things like that, because if you double the length of your animation, then you'll still be having, in this case, 5000 particles, but now over 500 frames. So you will want to increase the number of particles, probably double them. I'm sure you could do that procedurally as well. But for the mist, I felt that seemed to work quite well. So let's bring our trees back and give that a render and see what we've got. The only thing I would say is this top setting, we're going to need to tweak that because at the moment it's white, which means we'll go up to maximum density on our mist, and that may well be too much. It almost certainly will be too much. In fact, I'm just going to turn the trees on. I go to my land and I'll enable them. Just save it first, and we'll turn off the overlay. Never mind that you can see this up here. That's just because it's in the preview and obviously it's casting a shadow. I can obviously disable the visibility of the snow generator, and that takes that out of it. So you can see the mist is very dense. Now if that's what you want, fine. I wanted more subtle mist, so what I did was select that top slider and change the color of it to somewhat closer to this one. So I pulled that down like this, and you can already see that's much more subtle mist now. It's not at all as dense as it was, and I can bring it down a little bit more there. Obviously it's not denoised at the moment, so let's just give that a quick render. I'll turn on denoise for the render, but we'll only do a few samples. So let's just do 16 samples. That's very, very low. It's really pushing it, but we'll see what that looks like, and I'll come out of rendered view for the preview. So there it is. That's not a bad render. Obviously it was a very low number of samples, which means you do lose a little bit of detail, especially when you denoise it, but that's not bad. The only thing I would say is the render time for my particular setup, and my graphics card's getting a little old now, was a minute. And therefore you might think, well, that's going to be really painful trying to do an animation in that. And that's true. But if you come down to performance, what you can do is you don't need to use tiling. You can render the whole thing. That may speed it up a little bit. Use spatial splits. This will give you a faster render. And also turn on the most important one, persistent data. And what that will mean is your first frame will be about the same. It might even be slightly slower. But after that, any geometry that hasn't changed, which is for a scene like this, the majority of the geometry, will be reused, will be kept in memory and reused, and therefore the re-render time, when it renders the next image, it will have to do a lot less calculations, and so you'll often find it'll take about half as long. If I re-render this again, because I've only just turned on persistent data, it will have to go through it all. You see it's building BVH and duplicates and all that sort of business, and you can see that video RAM and memory are being used up here. So you can see that actually took slightly longer, and that's typical because it's having to store some extra stuff on the hard drive, so that takes it a little bit longer. But when I re-render, that should be quicker. but I've noticed I'm rendering frame 1, so there's no snow in the scene. So let's go out to here. I'm not sure, but it should still have all the geometry stored, so we'll find out. In fact, we'll go up to somewhere around there and we'll give that a re-render. So the snow's not awfully visible. You can see a little bit of it up there, but you'll notice the time has already come down to 1 minute from 1.5 minutes. And obviously you can play around with that and play around with things like whether you use tiling and whatnot. Sometimes a specific tile size will be optimal for your particular graphics card. You just need to play around with it and see what works for you. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, let me know. I will upload the original file for my Patreon supporters to use for any purpose. Otherwise, I will see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.